Sherlock Holmes alongside Conan, is one of the greatest detectives of all time. Even though he is only a literary character, the 4 novels about Holmes are 4 captivating detective adventures that draw readers in because of how incredibly thrilling they are. And besides those 4 classic novels, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle also wrote countless other short stories exploring this detective's adventures. Today we will look back at the most captivating adventures of Holmes through the short story collections. Let's begin with A Scandal in Bohemia. If you're used to the image of Holmes completely outsmarting his enemies in the novels, then you might be a little surprised. Specifically, this is how it all happened. A few years after moving out of Holmes's place, Watson paid a visit to his old friend one day. At this time, Holmes was still the same, still addicted to cocaine and entertaining himself by reading books. While the two were happily reminiscing, a representative of the King of Bohemia suddenly entered. This man had come to ask Holmes to solve a few problems for his client. Holmes took one look at him and immediately made his deduction. This man's name is this. The name's a bit long, so I won't read it. He is the Grand Duke of Cassel-Felstein and the hereditary King of Bohemia. Realizing he was dealing with an expert, the future king dropped the pretense and begged for Holmes's help. The thing is, 5 years ago, this King von Ormstein had an affair and had a photograph taken with a woman named Irina Adler. Now that photograph is in Adler's possession, and she is threatening to send it to his betrothal ceremony to sabotage his upcoming wedding. His fiance's family was extremely prim and proper, so they would never accept a son-in-law with a scandalous past, let alone one who'd been photographed in such a way. That's why he came to Holmes, to help him retrieve the photograph from Adler, who by coincidence was now also living in London. And so Holmes and Watson teamed up once again to devise a plan to approach Irene Adler and get the photograph back. After the client left, Holmes arranged for Watson to come back the next day to discuss the details. The next day, Watson arrived as scheduled, but Holmes was nowhere to be found. Just as he was thinking, his friend had stood him up. Watson saw a drunkard dressed in rags stumble in. It turned out to be none other than Holmes. He had disguised himself to get close to the Adler residence. Afterwards, Holmes started telling Watson about the information he'd gathered. Essentially, Irene was in love with a lawyer named Godfrey Norton, and the two of them had just gotten married that very day. This part's pretty funny. Holmes had tailed them to spy on them, and by chance the wedding was short. A best man. So Holmes was pulled in to participate. After the wedding was over, Holmes rushed back to Watson to plan their next move. According to Holmes's deduction, since she was now in a new relationship, it was certain that Irina wouldn't want her new husband to see the photograph. And that picture was about 10 by 16, too large to be hidden on her person. Therefore, the picture must be hidden somewhere in her house. The two of them then planned to break into Adler's home. Before they got started, Holmes asked Watson if he was willing to do something illegal. Watson said he wouldn't hesitate to break the law for a just cause. Just kidding. In reality, they approached Adler's residence around the time she usually returned home. At that moment, a crowd was gathered nearby, presumably a group of loafers waiting for Adler to show up so they could hustle her for a few coins. Holmes waited for Adler to appear, then pretended to help her push through the crowd, getting himself injured in the process. Seeing that Holmes was hurt, the crowd urged Adler to take Holmes inside to see how badly he was injured. After Holmes was inside, Watson, just as they had planned, threw a smoke rocket in through the window of the residence and began shouting over and over that there was a fire. This caused the crowd from before to start shouting as well. After a moment of chaos, Holmes came out to reassure everyone that it was a false alarm, and then he and Watson slipped away. On the way back to 221B Baker Street, Holmes announced that he had discovered the photograph's location. Hearing this, Watson couldn't quite process it for a moment, still unable to imagine how Holmes had managed it. Holmes began to explain that the people in the crowd had been hired by him to perform an act, the one that just took place. As soon as she saw the smoke and heard the shouting, Adler had rushed to save the photograph. To know where she had hidden it, all one had to do was watch her behind a secret panel in the living room. And since he now knew the location, Holmes would send a telegram to the king telling him to come and retrieve it with him tomorrow. And that would be that. When they arrived back at their rooms, Holmes suddenly heard a strange voice call his name. The voice was very familiar, but Holmes couldn't recognize who it belonged to. Immediately after, a tall, slender figure glided past, but Holmes still couldn't make out anything. The next morning, Holmes Watson and the king went to Adler's residence as planned. But surprise, surprise, Adler and her husband had fled long before dawn. Holmes, still reeling from the shock, was informed by the mansion's mate that her mistress would never return, so there was no point in them searching for her any longer. Holmes then rushed into the mansion's drawing room, searching for the hiding place of yesterday's photograph. But all he found there was a letter, along with a photograph of Adler. In the letter, Adler confessed that she had been tricked by Holmes. However, she had quickly realized her own carelessness and had disguised herself to follow Holmes in return, after confirming that Holmes was after the photograph she and her husband fled. Of course, she was still keeping the photograph as a form of insurance. If Ormstein had any ill intentions, she'd ensure they both went down together. But Holmes was furious because this was the first time he had ever been outplayed by someone. So instead of accepting any of the other rewards, he only asked Ormstein to let him keep the photograph of Irene Adler. Initially, Holmes had rather looked down on the reasoning abilities of women. But after this incident, he learned to respect women, more especially when it came to Irene Adler. He would often refer to her respectfully as the woman. Contrary to many adaptations in the original story, Holmes had no romantic feeling for her whatsoever. It was simply respect, as she was the first person to have ever outplayed him, the Red-Headed League. On one occasion, Watson was invited by Holmes to help him crack a tough case. By this time, Watson was already married with a family, so he only helped out with these cases part-time. When he arrived, Watson found Holmes consulting with their client, Jabez Wilson. As soon as they met, Watson had been impressed by Wilson's fiery red hair. And as it happened, this particular case also involved that very same brilliant red hair. Basically, the man was a pawnbroker in the city. A month ago, he had hired an assistant named Vincent Spaulding. Spaulding had a peculiar habit of often taking photographs and then going down to the cellar to develop them, but in return, he was a very competent worker, and he even agreed to work as an apprentice for half pay. As a result, Wilson trusted him completely. One day, Spaulding told Wilson about the Red-Headed League. It was an organization founded by an eccentric American millionaire to support other red-headed men like himself. Participants would be assigned a few tasks for a rather handsome salary. Wilson later joined this league and was given the assignment of copying the Encyclopedia Britannica by hand. The work took place at the league's office from 10 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, and during that time he was not allowed to leave for any reason. For 8 weeks, Wilson went to work at the Red-Headed League, right up until this morning. When he arrived, Wilson was informed that the league had been dissolved, and the league's manager, Duncan Ross, was nowhere to be found. Sensing that something was amiss, Wilson immediately went to Holmes to ask for help. After hearing the story, Holmes immediately declared that he would solve this mystery within a few days' time. After seeing his client out, the man sat smoking his pipe continuously for nearly an hour, then dragged Watson along to a concert. On the way, Holmes made a stop at Wilson's pawn shop, tapped his walking stick on the pavement before speaking up to ask Spaulding for directions. After their conversation, Holmes and Watson left. Holmes said he saw what he needed to see on Spaulding's knees, and also remarked that the man was quite clever, and that this case was a large-scale plot. The two then walked around the neighborhood to get a clear idea of the position of the buildings. The most noteworthy point was that behind Wilson's pawn shop was a large bank. Other than that, there was nothing else. After finishing his observation, Holmes actually took Watson to a concert to unwind. At this point, we can clearly see just how eccentric Holmes is. As they were leaving, Holmes instructed Watson to gather at Baker Street tonight at 10 o'clock to start solving the case, and to remember to bring his revolver. That day, Watson arrived at the appointed time. Holmes had also invited 2 other people, Inspector Jones and the bank manager, from behind the pawn shop of Mr. Merriweather. At this point, I'm sure you all can guess what was about to happen. Holmes then led everyone to the bank's vault, where a large amount of gold was kept, and they waited in the dark. Before long, 2 suspicious men appeared from a hole in the wall. Holmes and Jones quickly rushed in to subdue one of them, but the other man managed to escape. The man who was caught was none other than Vincent Spaulding, or rather the notorious thief John Clay. And with that, the case was closed, as the mastermind was sent to prison by Inspector Jones. The next morning, as the two sat having breakfast and tea, Holmes began to explain to Watson, first of all, the existence of a league, how he had solved the case. Like the Red-Headed League sounded very fishy, so he immediately suspected that Spaulding and his accomplices had cooked up this scheme to lure Wilson out of his house, forcing him to be at the office every day. It was obviously to keep Wilson from controlling what was happening at his shop. Second, there was Spaulding. He was willing to work for such a low salary, and spent a lot of time alone in the basement. That had to mean he was up to something shady. When Holmes saw the nearby bank, he suspected the guy was digging a tunnel leading to it. There's a detail where Holmes taps his stick on the ground, and then goes to ask Spaulding for directions. This was the moment he was checking which way the tunnel and whether on Spaulding himself there were any signs of digging. Third, the disbanding of the Red-Headed League meant that the preparations of Spaulding and his accomplices were complete, so they would definitely act as soon as possible. That's why Holmes contacted Inspector Jones and the bank manager, Merriweather, to set a trap and catch him. All in all, this case is pretty thrilling. It shows Holmes's extraordinary powers of deduction. It's pretty cool, you should give it a read. The Adventure of the Speckled Band. According to Watson's own account, this was one of the most thrilling cases that he and Holmes ever solved. The story takes place during the period when Watson was still working as Holmes's assistant. One morning, a young woman named Helen Stoner came to Holmes for help. According to her story, this young woman was facing a situation that was extremely mysterious and terrifying, something that couldn't be explained by conventional means. First, let's talk a little about this character's family background. That would be Helen's stepfather, Dr. Grimsby Roylott, the last descendant of the aristocratic Roylott family of Stoke Moran. Although they had the noble title, the family fortune had been exhausted after generations of extravagance and gambling. As for Helen's late mother, Mrs. Stoner, she was a wealthy woman whose husband had tragically died young. Helen had a twin sister named Julia. Helen's mother had met and married Roylott in India when Helen was just a child. So in the beginning, she was actually quite close to her stepfather. 8 years ago, Mrs. Stoner passed away in a train accident. So Roylott brought Helen and Julia to live at Stoke Moran. Before her death, Helen's mother had drawn up a will as a precaution, which stipulated that Roylott would inherit her estate. However, when either Helen or Julia married, they would also be entitled to a percentage of the annual income from this fortune. It was from that moment on that Roylott began to show his true colors. He not only picked fights with his neighbors, but also treated the sisters horribly. Not only that, he had a bizarre hobby of letting several wild animals sent to him by friends in India roam free, such as a cheetah and a baboon. This had a very negative impact on the lives of the people in the area. Hearing this, Holmes and Watson were rather confused, but Helen continued her story, telling them about her sister's death 2 years ago. Around that time, Julia had just gotten engaged, and from that point on, Julia would often hear a whistling sound late at night, which was rather terrifying. This went on right up until the day Julia died. One night, Helen heard her sister's blood-curdling scream. As soon as she opened her door to check, she saw her sister staggering out from her room with a ghastly, pale look on her face. A face that was deathly white. Her body swayed unsteadily. She kept screaming over and over about a speckled band. Terrified, Helen called out to Roylott for help, and since their 2 rooms were right next to each other along a long corridor, it happened rather quickly. Roylott, still groggy with sleep, clumsily rushed out to help Julia, but all his efforts were in vain. A moment later, Julia officially departed from this world. Hearing this, Holmes asked Helen to share the coroner's conclusions. Helen said that before Julia opened the door, the room had been locked from the inside, the chimney was barred, and the window was fastened securely from within, so it was certain that no one could have broken in through those routes. The walls were completely solid, ruling out the possibility of any secret passages, so there was no way someone could have entered the room and harmed Julia. Holmes asked another question. Did the phrase, "the speckled band," offer Helen any clues? Helen replied that she wasn't sure, but Roylott had befriended some gypsies and allowed them to live on his estate. Some of them wore spotted headscarves, so she didn't know if her sister's dying words might have been referring to them. Hearing this, Holmes seemed a bit uncertain, because that alone wasn't enough to conclude anything. So he asked Helen to continue. At this point, Helen got straight to the matter. A month ago, she had become engaged and was currently staying in the old room where Julia had once lived because her own room was being renovated, and coincidentally, from that moment on, she began to hear the whistling in the middle of the night again. Fearing that the same tragedy would befall her, Helen decided to make the journey to London to seek help from the renowned detective Sherlock Holmes. After hearing Helen's story, Holmes and Watson decided to go to the location to investigate firsthand. Holmes told Helen he would arrive that afternoon and then saw her out. Afterwards, he turned to discuss this strange case further with Watson. Neither Watson nor Holmes could draw any conclusions based on the information provided. While the two were still pondering Dr. Roylott suddenly opened the door, storming in to aggressively threaten Holmes and Watson, telling them not to stick their noses in other people's business, or else. But faced with Holmes's defiant attitude, there was nothing the old man could do, so he had no choice but to leave. It was from this moment that Holmes and Watson both directed all their suspicion towards the doctor. That afternoon, the two of them set off for the Roylott estate. As they began their journey, Holmes informed Watson that he had discovered Roylott had the strongest motive for the crime. To be honest, we don't even need to read the story to figure that one out. Right, the reason is that if both daughters were to get married, his inheritance would be significantly reduced. He also advised Watson to bring a revolver just to be safe, because this Roylott fellow seemed quite fond of violence. Upon arriving, the two met Helen and then accompanied her to the manor to investigate. First, Holmes inspected Julia's former room. After a period of observation, he concluded that the room could not, in fact, have been broken into from the outside. There was one suspicious detail: the room's ventilator, however, was connected to Roylott's room, and the bell pull in the room wasn't connected to the servants' quarters, but instead went through this ventilator. This part needs a little explanation. You see, back in the day before telephones, people would design a system of bells. This allowed people to, call a servant from afar by pulling a cord. Based on these suspicious signs, Holmes moved on to examine Roylott's room. There was nothing unusual in Roylott's room except for a large iron safe with a saucer of milk placed on top, and a leather whip. It had a long lash tied into a knot and was hanging next to the bed. At this point, Holmes could no longer keep a calm expression. He then asked for permission to go out onto the lawn to think. Watson and Helen saw Holmes's face, tense as a fiddle string, and could only trail along behind him, watching the detective's every move. After a moment, Holmes spoke in a grave tone, telling Helen that moving forward, she must strictly follow the rules he was about to set, because her life was hanging by a thread. Hearing this, Helen turned pale with fear and promised to do exactly as Holmes instructed, not daring to disobey. The three of them then made a plan for that evening. Specifically, Holmes and Watson would rent a room on the second floor of the inn, opposite the Roylott Manor. As for Helen, she was to tell her stepfather that she would be staying in her room all evening because she had a headache. When she was certain Roylott was asleep, she was to open the window and place a lamp there to signal Holmes and Watson. After that, Helen had to immediately return to her old room and let the two of them take over the room. With the plan settled, Holmes and Watson returned to the inn to wait for Helen's signal. At around 11 o'clock at night, they saw the light and rushed to the manor. After sneaking into the room through the window, Holmes and Watson sat waiting in the darkness for hours. Until about 3 in the morning, a faint light flickered from the ventilator, accompanied by a steady whistling sound. Mixed with it was another sound, a hissing like a boiling kettle. This was the signal. Holmes struck a match to get a better look. The color instantly drained from his face. He then used his cane to strike furiously and repeatedly at the bell pull rope. Watson, seeing this, was completely stunned. He thought his friend had been possessed and didn't dare to utter a word. After a moment, Holmes stopped. He turned to Watson, asking if he had seen what he had just seen. Before Watson could even answer, a terrifying blood-curdling scream erupted from Roylott's room. Hearing it, Holmes declared that it was all over, and went with Watson to check on Roylott's room. Inside Roylott's room was a truly horrific sight. Dr. Roylott was sitting on a chair, dead and rigid. In his hand was a long-handled whip, and wrapped tightly around his head was a speckled band. But upon closer inspection, Watson realized it wasn't a band at all. It was a speckled snake. Holmes then explained everything to Watson. It was a swamp adder, the deadliest snake in India. At this point, everything became clear. Roylott had been keeping the snake in his room, and using it to plot the murder of his 2 stepdaughters, all to seize their inheritance. The speckled band that Julia mentioned with her dying breath was in fact the snake, which she had described in a state of panic, and just moments ago when Roylott had released the snake, letting it crawl along, following the bell pull to go over and bite Helen. But he was stopped by Holmes. When he struck the bell pull, it startled the snake, causing it to turn around and bite Roylott instead, ending the doctor's life. The next morning, Holmes and Watson informed Helen of Roylott's death, but they hid the truth about Roylott's plot. They were afraid she wouldn't be able to handle the shock. And because they both concealed the details of the incident, the coroner's office could only conclude that Roylott, out of sheer boredom, had been playing a foolish game with his pet snake, and it backfired, biting him to death. After returning to London the next day, Holmes confessed to Watson that he had initially directed his suspicion toward the gypsies, guessing that Roylott had hired them to kill Julia by breaking into her room. But after going to the scene to investigate, he had dismissed that theory. And because he indirectly caused Roylott's death, Holmes felt a little guilty. In general, these kinds of minor details were added by Surrey, Arthur, to show that Sherlock, Holmes also made wrong guesses sometimes. Not that he was some kind of infallible psychic, and it also shows that Holmes was a compassionate person, not just some extremely rational machine. I'll make a part 2 continuing with Holmes's cases. I'll give you a sneak peek. It will be about the case of the blue carbuncle, the Musgrave ritual, and the final problem, especially the story The Final Problem, which also marks the first time Holmes was killed off by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. If you guys enjoyed this, you can model, like, and comment to show your support. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any videos. Goodbye and see you next time.